what is the role of scientific prediction? Well, there are different explanations for why societies get into end times. And they propose often the opposite mechanisms for the observed data. So what we need to do, what is the scientific approach, is that we take those explanations, translate them into mathematical theories. That's very important because human societies are dynamical systems with many interlinked parts. And understanding how different little nudges or pushes result in different outcomes requires mathematical apparatus.
It is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the podcast one of my favorite thinkers on societies coming apart. Yes, that's actually a field now, thanks to him. University of Connecticut professor and author of the new book, End Times, Elites, Counter-Elites, and the Path of Political Disintegration. Peter Turchin. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Andrew.
Peter, I cited your book, Ages of Discord, in my last two books. You have somehow gotten yourself wrapped up in the disintegration of societies, but you came to this from a completely different discipline. You came it from, I want to say, as an ecologist and studier of systems. Can you talk about how you wound up in this field?
Yes, I was trained as a theoretical biologist, and I worked on population cycles in insects, mice, deer, and lemmings. And when I turned 40, I essentially had a midlife crisis. But instead of divorcing my wife, I divorced my science and married a new one. Essentially, I wanted to encounter some challenges. And studying history from the point of view of complexity science sounded like a challenge enough for me. And that's what I've been doing for the past 25 years.
And so you've helped to start a new field that's called Cliodynamics. Can you describe what Cliodynamics is?
Yes, essentially, when I started working became interested in history, I realized that history was the last subject that has not yet been mathematized. Other social sciences, especially economics, but also political science, sociology, they had mathematical models and they were testing those models with data. But in history, this was not done in a systematic manner. So I and my colleagues came up with this name, Cliodynamics. Clio is the muse of history, of course, and dynamics is the science of change. And what is history? History is about how things change in time. So dynamics, the dynamical approaches are natural for applying to history. And by the way, I am not only studying why societies break down. In fact, I study both. How come we live in large-scale, complex societies? Almost 100% of people today lives in such societies, are organized as states. But these societies are only 5,000 years old. For 95% of our evolutionary history, humans lived in small-scale, simple societies, and then suddenly there was this incredible evolution. So that is one of the two big questions. And the second question, of course, is why do such societies periodically enter into end times? Periods of social dysfunction, political disintegration, sometimes leading to pretty dire outcomes.
It's true, I misspoke, Peter, because you talk about how there are extended periods of integration followed by extended periods of disintegration. So it's not like you just study them coming apart, you study them coming together. And you do have some positive recommendations as to how you can better integrate society.
Yeah, and end times are also times of new beginnings. And that's what you...
End times are also times of new beginnings. Amen. Yeah. I'm all about that.
Exactly.
For sure. It's like we might as well start something positive if you can sense that things are not trending in a good direction. So your work first hit my radar in part because you made what seemed like a bold prediction about 10 years ago, where people asked you what you saw coming down the pike, and you saw a very, very rough political time. Now, this is back before Trump, before a lot of things. So what were the variables that made you think that we were in for this rough period politically?
But let me first step back and explain why I made this prediction. This was not a prophecy. It was a scientific prediction. What is the role of scientific prediction? Well, there are different explanations for why societies get into end times. And they propose often the opposite mechanisms for the observed data. So what we need to do, what is the scientific approach, is that we take those explanations, translate them into mathematical theories. That's very important because human societies are dynamical systems with many interlinked parts. And understanding how different little nudges or pushes result in different outcomes requires mathematical apparatus. All right, so that's the first step, to translate the different theories into predictions, and then we need massive data to test those predictions. My colleagues and I, we have been building massive databases to do this, and we had used a method we call retrodiction. Essentially, this is predicting what happened in the past. This is a true scientific prediction because you don't know until you actually look what happened to a particular society. And so that is a severe test of theories. But at the same time, when I saw what trends were developing in the United States, this was around 2008 or so, I actually, truthfully, I was shocked because it suddenly dawned on me that the United States stepped on this path to political disintegration, fragmentation already by 1980s, essentially. And therefore, I thought that this offers us, in my model that I ran forward, suggested that it would be around 2020, early 2020s, when things, a variety of trends would come to a head, and that would be the most likely time for some kind of a social rupture to happen. And so I used this as a way to test theory and see whether it would be true. And alternative theories, by the way, always test predictions against alternative theories. Alternative theories were saying that actually things were getting better. For example, Steven Pinker, Max Roser, and they all have been pointing to the trends that have been getting better and better. But my theory said that there's going to be trend reversal. All right, and so that's why this is a good example of scientific prediction, because we have different theories predicting different things, and then we waited 10 years, and unfortunately we saw what we saw.
Well, the model took in a bunch of data points, and the data points struck me as fascinating, where your model included things like average income growth or lack of growth, but also things like average height, visits to national monuments, trust of public institutions, elite overproduction. You had a bunch of inputs that I had not considered before, though when I thought about them, they made sense to me. I thought average height was incredible. Life expectancy was another. And when I was running for president, I would say to folks, look, life expectancy has gone down for the last 3 years. I mean, that's pretty basic. That's fundamental. We're not living as long. And so you're seeing these gains and these riches, but they're not being enjoyed by the average American. And if anything, the average American in some quarters is more likely to drink themselves to death or die of a drug overdose or have other problems. And they certainly didn't feel included in any good things that were happening somewhere else. So can you talk about what data points went into the model and how you determined which ones were relevant?
Yes, the ideas about what data to look at came from historical analysis. We, at this point, when I wrote the book, we had about 100 societies, past societies, sliding into crisis and then emerging from it. Now we are approaching 200 of our sample size. And so what we see is the common theme on the road to crisis is elite overproduction. All right, so that's even more important than what we call popular immiseration that can be measured with things like life expectancy and things like that. So perhaps this is a good time for me to explain what I mean by elite overproduction.
Yeah, please. It's an important idea in your book.
That's right.
So let's break it down first. Like, what the heck do you mean by elite?
Exactly. Who are the elites? Simply put, it's a neutral thing. It's not good people, bad people. It's simply a small proportion of the population that concentrates social power in their hands. So think about the proverbial 1% in America. Oh, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But also, Mandarin class in Imperial China, or if you go back into the past, military nobility in England, France. So these are people with power. And the next question you want to ask about elite is the dynamics of it. How are they reproduced and recruited? That's the key question. There's always more people who want to acquire elite positions, the positions of power. So we call such elite wannabes elite aspirants. All right, and that's normal, and some competition is good. However, sometimes in societies, the number of elite aspirants begins to grow rapidly and completely overwhelms the number of power positions. We saw this happen in 2016 when there were 17 Republican candidates in the presidential primaries. And one individual started breaking rules, and it was followed by others, and very soon things degenerated into something that nobody expected. But that's a normal outcome. We see this in medieval societies. We see this in periods preceding such, breakdowns like French and Russian revolutions. American Civil War is another example. In all the run-ups to this huge crisis, there was a very severe problem of elite overproduction. And that is what led to the breakdown of social norms, and eventually it led to bloodshed. 600,000 people killed in the American Civil War, for example.
Some things we do in public, some things we do in private. And we certainly would like to be able to know that when we're alone, we're actually getting our privacy. Online is the same thing. Your online privacy is just as important as in the real world. That's why I use ExpressVPN when I'm online, because I don't want my internet service provider to know every website I visit, nor do I want them to sell my data to big tech companies. ExpressVPN creates a secure encrypted connection, a tunnel between your device and the internet. No one can see it. It works on any device. All you have to do is fire up the ExpressVPN app, click one button. It's as easy as that. I recommend this. Fortune 500 companies use ExpressVPN for good reason. And you can get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN free by going to expressvpn.com/yang. That's expressvpn.com/yang for 3 extra months free. expressvpn.com/yang. Yeah, one of the more foreboding predictions is that, according to your model, there's a diminution in the number of elites. So you look at that and be like, well, how do you shrink that number? So let me dig in a second. When you say that the definition of elite, it certainly includes money. You describe America as a plutocracy, which I find pretty inarguable and don't find problematic. But when you talk about the elite, you're not solely talking about people with big bank accounts. There are other forms of power.
Exactly. There are really 4 forms of social power. First of all is coercion or military power. Then it's economic elites, money, wealth. Then we have more subtle form of power, which is administrative or political power. And finally, the softest power is ideological power, which can be very powerful too. And what happens is that different societies tend to specialize in different types of elites, right? So, for example, medieval societies, they were ruled by meritocracies, essentially knights, right? But our democratic societies are typically ruled by a coalition between economic and administrative or political elites. But the relative power changes between those two members of the coalition. In the United States, it's actually quite unusual for OECD countries because of such dominance by the economic elites. So we're thinking about people with wealth, not just the 1%, but also 1/10 of 1% or even 1% of 1%. So these are the people who concentrate huge amount of wealth, and the wealth is translated into power.
Yeah, so again, your four forms of power are physical, which you hope is not as much of a factor in the U.S. because the state has something of a quasi-monopoly on coercive armed might. Then you have economic, which I think people understand. And then you have bureaucratic, which is who's actually running various institutions and their mechanisms. And then the fourth is ideological or soft power, which you say includes having lots of social media followers. That would fall into the soft power category, which I agree can be very important.
More traditional, think about religious leaders. In fact, there is one country, Iran, where the ideological elites are dominant, all right? But also it's people who write for New York Times columns, and the people who have huge following on their podcasts or blogs and things like that.
So by these definitions, Peter, would you consider yourself an elite?
I am essentially a 10%er. All right. So these are described as sort of lower rank elites. So we have power in the sense that we have power over our own lives. All right. So for example, don't have to move to a place where I don't want to move. I don't need to take a job that I don't like and things like that. But I don't have a lot of power over other people. And of course, you have to realize that there is no sharp boundary. In medieval societies, there was a sharp boundary. You either you were noble, had a patent and so on, or you were a peasant and so on. But in our societies, the boundary is much softer, and so the power grades. The more wealth you have, and the higher you are in the administrative hierarchy, the more power you have. There is no sharp boundary.
You know what's funny, Peter, is I was reflecting on this a little bit, and one of the problems, which I guess gets us into elite overproduction, is I know a lot of people who would technically be considered elite under your definition who don't feel themselves to be elite. It's kind of one of the problems, isn't it?
Well, we have this mythology in the United States that we live in a classless society, and therefore, people don't want to admit that they have huge amounts of power. But I'm a scientist. I write in the book that we want to stay away from ideologies, and we want to study how society works in the most objective and even-handed manner. And the truth is, if you look at the United States, you certainly see that the proverbial 1% is a real thing. Not everybody of the top 1% in the wealth exercises their power. They have that power, but they don't exercise it, perhaps because they just amuse themselves flying to posh resorts, and things like that. But they do have that power if they wished to exercise it, whereas I don't. I don't have enough wealth to buy senators, to influence political process and things like that.
Hey, YouTube. Glad you're enjoying the podcast. If you really like it, hit subscribe, and then YouTube will notify you every time we have a bang-up new guest. Thank you. So, Peter, when I see elite overproduction, what comes to mind for me is you have a lot of people getting college degrees and advanced degrees, and then not enough spots for them, whatever the heck that means. And there are a couple of examples that I've spoken on before. For example, the number of tenure track academic positions is at best staying the same, but you keep producing a gajillion new PhDs every year, and so it's like they're not going to be able to become professors in the way that you'd imagine. So that's an evident one. There are less evident ones where you are producing tons of college graduates who may or may not have the kind of secure livelihoods that they might have expected. Is that what you mean by elite overproduction primarily, is just we're producing tons more people with various credentials who then get frustrated and pissed off?
Partly what you're describing is people, in fact, let's step back and talk about immiseration, because this is going to be critical in order for me to explain, to answer your question.
So one of the problems you note is that of the wealth that's been produced in the U.S. over the last several decades, it seems to have collected in the hands of the top tenth of 1%, top 1%, and to a lesser extent, the top 10%. And the average American has seen barely anything over that period. And by the way, the cost of education, or the cost of healthcare, cost of housing keep going up and up, and in some cases are totally unattainable for the average American in a way that they would have been attainable a couple generations ago, because cost of public education, maybe you had the GI Bill, stuff was pretty accessible, and now it's not. And now immiseration. Go ahead.
So, for example, a household in the working class, so people without college degrees, if they want, how many years they need to work to pay average college for their daughter or son? Well, it used to be about a year or so. Now it's nearly 4 years. So you can see that this is huge. The measure of inflation doesn't really capture important things like education, medical care, housing. So those are important aspects of middle class life. But okay, so the question is, first of all, why does elite overproduction develop in societies? All right, and so here, what we observe in one past society after another is that, as we were talking about, they tend to go through about a century-long plus minus periods of integrative periods when internal order and peace and things are working pretty well. What happens typically is that the ruling class gets used to these conditions, and then they become tempted to reconfigure economy in ways that would benefit them rather than the rest of the population. And why? Well, just because they can. It's the iron law of oligarchy. And this is what happened in the United States in the late 1970s. We've all seen this graph where the productivity of American workers keeps going up, and then in the late 1970s, prior to that, the wages have been going up, and then boom, there's flat or stagnating or even declining. And so this is what has driven immiseration, which is a real thing, because you mentioned the overdoses and alcoholism. Well, the technical name for it is the deaths of despair. It also includes suicides, and also people become more likely to have fatal accidents. That's because they don't care about life. They're feeling that they are losing ground so much that they do all those things. So that's immiseration. And when I started giving talks about this, I was saying that, of course, we live in post-Malthusian times, and therefore I would not expect to see the typical phenomenon that we see in previous end times, which is the decline in life expectancy. And I was wrong, because, as you said, around 2017, we saw the first decline, and now it's just, we have lost like more than 20 years of progress in life expectancy in America. So this is a real thing. All right, but then what happens to all that extra wealth that workers are generating? that drives the what I call the wealth pump. It's the perverse wealth pump that transfers riches from the poor to the rich, essentially. And so it is quite remarkable that over this 40-year period of time, the number of uber rich, like people who have $10 million or more of wealth, it has exploded. It has grown tenfold. I mean, this is staggering. The population has grown 40%, but the number of decamillionaires grew tenfold. So that is actually one of two important pipelines that drive elite overproduction. So we are actually going to circle back to the question you asked. So first of all, because in the United States, the elites, if you want to become a senator or even president, right, there are two routes. First of all, you need to have a lot of wealth. All right. Second one, we'll talk about that later. You need certain educational credentials. All right. The wealth route is essentially some proportion of those very rich class. They want to translate their wealth into political office. So it's not just Donald Trump. It's also Michael Bloomberg. Also think about unsuccessful candidates like Steve Forbes. I don't know how many people remember his bid for presidency. So that is one pipeline that drives overproduction of elite aspirants for political positions in this case. The second pipeline is even more important numerically. If you don't have wealth, how do you get into political office? Well, the best route is law degree, and so we've been producing law degrees, and those individuals holding law degrees compete for the positions. All right, but the third and very subtle result of the wealth pump is that because of the immiseration of the majority of the population, that increases the desire of more ambitious individuals to leave it and at least get into 10%. So these are the three things that they're all they're rooted in the wealth pump. So that's sort of at the very basic level, what's fundamental level, what's driving things.
This podcast is sponsored by Helix Sleep. I've always been a mattress guy because it was common sense to me. You spend up to 8 hours a day sleeping, more if you're lucky, and so the right mattress can make a huge difference. What the heck does it mean for something to be the right mattress for you? You can take the Helix Sleep quiz and find your perfect mattress in under 2 minutes, sent to your door. You know they believe in their product because they offer a 100-night trial and a 10 to 15 year warranty to try out your new mattress. I endorse this mattress because I literally sleep on it, and so do my kids. There are a couple of mattresses in the house, and this is the one that they seek out, even though it was made for me. It's so good that even my kids are like, hey, they feel like it's made for them, but it's not. It's the number one mattress picked by GQ and Wired, and Helix is offering 20% off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners. Go to helixsleep.com/yang. This is their best offer yet, and it won't last long. With Helix, better sleep starts now. Yeah, most Americans can sense some of what you're talking about, certainly in terms of stable life getting harder and harder to come by. I mean, there are stats on Americans choosing not to have kids because they may or may not be able to support them in that way. So you have a very compelling picture of what comes next. There's something called the political stress index that uses some of these variables and says that we're now at a higher level of political stress than at any time since the first Civil War, or the only Civil War. We hope it's the only Civil War. And in your book, End Times, you talk about what you think is coming now, according to the data and the model. So if you had to describe to someone what you think is coming next, what do the next number of years hold in store?
First of all, I want to make a comment that getting into crisis, it's like a ball rolling down a narrow valley. So there's no place to go, which is why which is why I was fairly confident about making prediction back in 2010. But once you get to the crisis, you are on the cusp and all kinds of avenues open. That's, by the way, why we need such a massive number of historical case studies, is because there's so much variability in how past societies have exited from crisis. We need to understand why some of them end up in complete collapse. Most of the outcomes are fairly dire, quite bloody, but the question becomes then, how do we move our society in a more favorable direction? So here, we really don't care about prediction that much, right? What we care about is we want to understand what we need to do to avoid the really bad outcomes. And this is where the science of history, Cliodynamics, can be very useful. It's much more useful in this cusp. Predicting the future is not that useful, but predicting, trying to figure out what we need to do is the useful thing.
Well, Peter, there's one thing in your book, and you just mentioned it, where you said, look, when you get into this crisis mode, it takes years and years and years. And so one of the things you said in your book was, like, according to the model, even if you did do some good things on the policy side at this point, you're still going to hit the rocks because the boulder's been rolling downhill for so long. Is that accurate?
Yeah,
it strikes me as accurate, by the way. Like, we're at a point now where I feel like the conflict is rising, and it's beyond. Now, I'm all for various positive policies. I mean, I've dedicated a fair share of my career to trying to make some of these changes, and my personal life. But I thought that we're kind of in the throes of history, and the negative forces have been building for quite some time.
Yeah, exactly. The social system has quite a lot of inertia. So now that we are in a crisis, what we can do is negotiate or navigate a way out that is going to be less bloody than what's actually possible to happen. Many people look at the summer of 2020, well, including January 2021, and think that, okay, this was a spike, now we are past the worst. But what our historical analysis shows is that typically these periods run of civil disturbance and high political violence, they typically run 10 to 20 years, right? Sometimes, very few examples shorter. Sometimes if you have complete collapse, then essentially it's until something new comes around, all right? But it takes time for these things to work their way through the system. All right, and so the decisions that we collectively, and especially our political leaders, will be making in the next few years are going to have an effect, right? We are still going to be in crisis, but first of all, that will determine how we exit this crisis, but also more importantly, there would be another crisis coming along if we don't reconfigure our social system back to where it is much more sustainable.
So a turbulent 10 to 20 years makes sense to me intuitively, if that's the historical pattern. I am now trying to put forward a more positive brand of politics that gets beyond the two-party back and forth that I think is going to be kind of the flashpoint for a lot of this turbulence. It's going to be animating the hostility in various ways. Now, there are a bunch of common sense things I think you'd want us to be doing. And the obvious thing is, hey, if you got this aggregation of wealth and resources in the hands of a relative sliver of the population, maybe you should spread that out some. Maybe there are things you can do that spread the general prosperity. And you do have historical examples and international examples of countries that came together and said, you know what, we're going to actually try and spread the benefits. Heck, even the U.S. in an earlier time period resembled that. And so if you had to just make a couple of policy recommendations that you think, hey, either before, during, or after this turbulent period, like this is what's going to bring us back together, like what does that list look like?
Well, I'm not going to make specific policy recommendations. Let me explain. We do have several positive examples, and one of them you mentioned. It's United States during the Progressive and then New Deal era. It turns out, if you look at the data, that 1920 or so, there was a huge peak, plus minus several years, a huge peak of instability in the United States, which was quite similar to 1850s. But this time around, the elites managed to avoid another civil war. And what they did, they essentially shut down the wealth pump that was driving the problems during the 19th century. 1850s and 19th century was very similar to what we saw in the last 2 or 3 decades. Even there was a Gilded Age, we are now in the second Gilded Age, and things like that. And there are other examples like the Chartist period in Great Britain, like mid-19th century, and so on and so forth. So, but we don't just want to take those examples and follow them. We don't want to do exactly the same that the New Deal did. What they did, well, first of all, they gave power to workers to organize and negotiate. They imposed minimum wage, which kept, and it kept increasing it. And also they taxed the hell out of people with high incomes. So we don't have to do exactly the same thing. What we need to do, we need to shut down this wealth pump. So we need to get worker wages back on track together with the general economy. All right? But how we do it, redistribution is certainly one way, but also just simply increasing the minimum wage. It is mind-boggling to me that we have a democratic president in power, and the minimum wage is still the same pitiful 7.25 cents, and it's in real terms it keeps decreasing. All right. So there are some obvious things, but the specific mixture of what we need to do. This is the job for you guys.
A job for us.
Yes.
Challenge accepted, Peter. Well, I'd say some of the obvious things would be trying to increase our life expectancy, because if a negative life expectancy is correlated to this crisis, then maybe we should try and lengthen people's lives. Pretty straightforward. Who could be against that? Maybe try and make it so that our average height stays the same or goes up. I mean, I thought average height was hysterical. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it. Like if you have an unhappy population that isn't getting its basic needs met, then maybe they're not as tall or strong or healthy. I will also say I'm a parent. I have 2 boys, and I'm constantly telling them, like, eat. Like, you've only got one shot to grow. So I get it on that level. But I'd be trying to take shots at these variables that you describe. Public trust, that's a negative variable that's in your model. So, like, how can we get people to trust institutions again? That's going to be a lot. So there are a lot of things that we should do. Three-quarters of Americans wish they started investing earlier, and over 2/3 of Gen Zers feel the same way. You know why it's tough? It's because it's tricky. It's daunting. It's intimidating. You know who has started an app to solve that? Are the founders of Bloom. Bloom app is the award-winning financial services app. It's made by young people for young people. I've met the founders. They are great guys who want to make you or the people in your life who are young and just starting out financially literate. Check it out at bloomapp.com, and there's a special offer for listeners to this podcast. $15 in free stock and 1-month subscription for free. Go to bloomapp.com/yang to sign up today. bloomapp.com/yang. Why stay in the dark in terms of financial literacy? Let's get educated, people. bloomapp.com/yang. I'm curious, Peter, how has the response been to your work? Because you are one of the real handful of people doing this work. There was a period X years ago where if you were to mention something like, oh, we might get embroiled in like another civil war, that was completely off the table in certain quarters. Certain quarters would be like, that's nuts. You're nuts. And to the extent that people were saying that, it was people who were, let's say, kind of ultra conservatives, maybe, or like, separatist, alt right types. But now, folks all over the ideological spectrum are looking at it and saying, "Wow, that's a real possibility." Like, what has your experience been over the last really number of years that you've been making this case?
Well, yes, exactly. And initially, there's quite a lot of disbelief. Hell, it's hard for me to imagine that we would have something like American Civil War in this country now, as a human being, right? But as a scientist, I know that in previous pre-crisis periods, people also did not believe that they were going to get into, French nobles in 1780s had no idea that they would be put under the guillotine, and so on and so forth. Americans in 1850s did not think that there would be such a bloody civil war. But it happened anyway. Just because we cannot imagine it, it does not mean it can't happen. And humans have been becoming more civilized in a sense, all right? We care more about inflicting harm and killing other people. But that may not be yet enough, because if you look at it, there is a number of very modern societies. Think in the UK in the 1970s, Northern Ireland. Who would have thought that this democratic and intensely civilized society would get into a civil war, essentially? All right. So we need to be very serious about this possibility, and if we are, paradoxically, then we have a higher chance of avoiding it, because that's the other thing. In the successful cases that did not lead to civil war or revolution, what happened was the elites became very frightened, essentially, and they thought that a revolution was imminent. And that was a huge force that pushed them to adopt the necessary things. I don't know, when you are talking to other politicians and people like that, do you see that there is this feeling that we've got to do something? Is that taking hold? Or let me put it this way. Yesterday I looked at your party platform, and you are, I think very rightly, talking about how you're not left or right. All right? And that's, by the way, that's how typically societies exit this crisis, because they pull together, they bury the hatchet and between the different parties, and they essentially forge some kind of a cooperation. All right, but in order to do that, there has to be enough understanding that we are in the same boat, rather than it's the other side of the aisle that's the evil people, we have to destroy them, and back and forth. So what's your feeling about where we are in this process?
Oh, thank you, Peter. This is my mission. And in some ways, your work is heartening, though who wants to go through 10 to 20 years of bad times before everyone gets exhausted and then decides to come together? One of the major problems right now is that if you talk to someone in one party or another, they do tend to see it in terms of partisan conflict. And it's, oh, I got to fend off the other side. And that's more important than addressing some of these root problems. I think that we can hopefully, with the Forward Party, provide this coalition building and get beyond the back and forth, and then address some of the root causes, the immiseration. And this is, by the way, why I ran for president in the last cycle. And I had a vision that, hey, we could get in front of this thing and start trying to put out the fires. I still want to try and put out the fires. It's just now, I will be honest with you, I do feel like things might get worse before they get better.
That's my feeling too, by the way.
So the question is what the time frame is on when we can start doing the positives. Like what the vision you present, I can imagine growing conflict and then also growing interest. And this is something that you say in the book, which interested me a lot, was you said, look, there are actually going to be a lot of people that get pushed into can't we build a coalition camp because they're going to be turned off and disgusted by the conflict.
Yeah, yeah. But unfortunately, typically the conflict would have to get even worse before.
Even worse, yes.
Even worse before this realization takes root. Naively, I would like to think that we can learn from the past mistakes of past societies and avoid that stage. But realistically, it may be inevitable. I agree with you that I don't see also right now. I see mostly most of the energy is put into the internecine infighting rather than trying to address the deep causes.
Yeah, there are figures trying to change it. I consider myself one of them. We're just going to do the best we can, and it does seem like, again, I found your work both daunting and heartening simultaneously, because like I can see how what we're doing is the right move in the right direction, and I think the energy around us is just going to grow. But unfortunately, it might grow because the conflict gets worse. Like that could be the order of things.
Do you see any people in either Republican or Democratic Party who are current politicians who might be more amenable to this type of a message?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we talk to them all the time, and we're actually converting people who are office holders at various levels, state levels, a mayor or two mayors. So we're, and if you talk to them privately, by the way, a lot of them actually are interested and aligned. It's just they don't feel like it serves them politically to step forward just yet.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But the average American is very, very into what we're doing if they think it can work. And it sounds like, again, I mean, the history is on our side, for better or for worse.
Yeah. According to some studies, the degree of polarization within the non-elite population is actually not as huge as many people assume.
So fascinating, Peter. We'll have to have you back to talk about how to knit us back together. Peter Turchin, the author of End Times, Elites, Counter-Elites, and the Path of Political Disintegration. You've influenced my work profoundly. Anyone who's read my books knows that I've cited you often, and I hope that people pay attention to both your work and your recommendations.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me on your podcast.